Hello, welcome, Vitayamo, everyone, to St. Vladimir Institute's Meet Author Diana Stevan event. So this is our final event of the 2021 spring season here. My name is Julia Metelitsa. If you haven't met me before, I will be helping manage some of the questions, helping out Laurisa, and run the technology throughout the hour. So there are many of us here registered for the event, so please remember to keep yourselves muted to avoid any sort of interferences. We do invite you to, however, keep your camera on if you wish to do so we can see who else is here with us tonight. With that being said, I want to let you know that the meeting is being recorded and it will be on the SVI YouTube channel to view and share with your friends after the event. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to send them through the Zoom chat, and that's located at the bottom of your screen. So I know looks like we have a lot of people letting us know where they're tuning in from tonight. So that's wonderful to see that we have guests from coast to coast. And of course, Diana, who's in Vancouver. So I would like to first begin the event by acknowledging the land which I am located on here in Toronto, which may also be the case for some of you. It is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and other agreements, and I encourage you to find out what land you currently live on as well. I would also like to take a moment and stand in solidarity with the First Nation communities around Canada and all Canadians as we mourn the unjust loss of the 215 Indigenous children whose remains were recently discovered at the Kamloops Residential School. Thank you. For those of you who are unfamiliar with St. Vladimir Institute, or SVI as we call it, it is a multifaceted institution in downtown Toronto, Canada, housing a 46-room student residence and providing a home to 13 organizations, including the Ukrainian Museum of Canada, Ontario branch, and the Seuss Foundation of Canada, its founding organization. SVI is also a public cultural center with a theater, library, and event spaces. It's a Ukrainian community hub offering cultural programming, Ukrainian language sessions, and social events, which is vibrant in the pre-pandemic world, during pandemic, and I'm sure will be vibrant post as well. So cultural programming is key to SVI's vision, mission, history, and legacy. It's key to strengthening the identity and community of individuals of Ukrainian descent, while making an important contribution to the national culture of Canada. And that's why we are here today. So I'm so glad all of you have joined us here tonight. And I'm going to turn things off first to Laurisa, Hrycyna, one of the founding members of the Rozmova Book Club. So a volunteer and board member of the Ukrainian Museum of Canada, Ontario branch, which is housed here at SVI. And she will now introduce our special guest, of course, Diana. So over to you, Laurisa, and hope everyone enjoys the evening.
Thank you, Julia, and what an honor it is to be a part of this Meet the Author event organized by St. Vladimir's Institute. Before I introduce our guest author, Diana Stevan, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Rozmova Book Club. It is the name of a book club based in Toronto, which is focused on exploring literature on Ukrainian themes by authors from around the world. The club is made up of a group of women from the Canadian Ukrainian diaspora who are interested in learning more about their roots, history, and culture. We have all said many times how we wished we had listened better and asked more questions of our parents and grandparents when they were with us to tell us their stories. Rozmova Book Club explores literature in English, both original or in translation, The club is dedicated to promoting such literature to like-minded readers and supporting authors who make it their work to tell these stories. To that end, one of our members, Karen Yarmol-Franco, created the Rozmova blog, where we have our reading list and book reviews available to everyone through the internet. A special welcome also to all the members of the newly formed We Are Ukrainian Book Club and its founder, Kathy Kostek. I'd like to now introduce our guest author, Diana Stevan. Diana is an independent self-published author who currently lives in British Columbia. She was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and was the only child of immigrant parents from Ukraine. Diana has had many careers as an adult, including working as a clinical social worker, teacher, school psychologist, model, and freelance sports writer, broadcaster. Certainly a woman with many talents. But Diana's passion was always writing. She wrote poems, short stories, and several novels. Her third novel, Sunflowers Under Fire, was a finalist in the 2019 Whistler Independent Book Awards for fiction and a semifinalist for the 2019 Kindle Book Awards literary fiction category. Sunflowers Under Fire is the story of Diana's real-life grandmother, Lucia Mazurits. And for anyone who has read that book will know the end leaves us wanting to know what happens next once Lucia comes to Canada. Diana Stevan's newly published book, Lilacs in the Dust Bowl, is the continuation of her Baba's story. Diana?
Thank you, Laurisa, for the lovely introduction, and St. Vladimir's Institute and Rozmova Book Club for having me. Writing my Baba's story was a labor of love, and so it wasn't an easy journey. There were many times that I cried at the computer, and I often thought that another title for Sunflowers Under Fire would have been the Oi, Oi, Oi book. And for Lilacs in the Dust Bowl, I thought Bida, misfortune. So there you go. It's as Laurisa said, there are many that wish they could have listened to their grandparents and their parents' stories about the old country. And I wish I had to, but I'm thankful that I wrote them down when my mother was still alive. So I had a lot to work from. I think I will share what I was hoping to do is share my slides. These are reference material that I use to write my books. And then after that, I can do an author reading, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions. So I will go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay. So behind the scenes, story behind the book. Now, I heard a lot of stories around growing up around the kitchen table.
Sorry, Diana. Oh, don't want to interrupt. We just don't see the slides.
You don't see
you can
the
start. Yeah, perhaps you can just reshare there.
Okay, go back. Shift. Okay, here we go. How's that?
Perfect. Just we can just enlarge them and we'll be great. Perfect. Thanks so much.
Okay, here we go. So behind the scenes, the story behind the book. My mother was the storyteller. There was 4 of us in the household. My father, Peter Kluchuk, who came from Bukovina when he was 2 years old with his mother, and to meet his father, who was already living in Winnipeg, and he came in 1912. And my mother, who arrived in 1929 with my Baba, Lucia Mazurits. She was 14 at the time, and Baba was 54, and this is me with them. And as Laurisa said, there were many stories around the kitchen table, and it wasn't until I was a lot older that I paid attention, which I did get an awful lot, but as anyone who has stories from their family, you always wish you had more. And there's just so many more questions I have even today. But to start with, for inspiration, I put Baba's photo on my desktop. This is Baba. This is Lucia Mazaretz when she was in her mid-80s in 1956 in the backyard of our home in Fort Rouge, Winnipeg. And Baba, right to the very end, helped to work in the garden. She made borscht. She helped make veraniki. And I shared a bedroom with her until I was 15. But Baba never talked about what happened in the old country. I became a family therapist later on, and I realized that maybe like people that come back from the wars, they don't want to talk about what they went through because the trauma can reawaken all the hurts. And Baba was pretty joyful when I was growing up, and very sweet and very caring, but she never talked about what she went through. And I never thought I would write her story. And it wasn't until I started sharing her story with my granddaughter, Chloe, that Chloe said to me, you should write her story. And that's how it all began. So I wrote Sunflowers Under Fire about her time in Ukraine. At that time, it was World War I, so it was under Russian rule. And so I wrote the story from 1915 to 1929, when Baba, Lucia Mazaretz, went through the Great War, the typhus epidemic, life in the refugee camp, and later on, life under Polish-occupied Ukraine. I thought I was finished writing the story, but readers started writing me and asking me what happened next. Well, when they asked for more, I thought, well, I had my characters. I had my mother's anecdotes. And so I began writing Lilacs in the Dust Bowl, which continues the story. It's actually my Baba's immigration story, her travel from Ukraine to Canada in the summer of 1929, just before the stock market crashes and the Great Depression begins. But there were missing pieces in my mother's story. My mother was a baby in 1915 at the beginning of Sunflowers Under Fire. So there were a lot of things I didn't know back then. And then later on, even with Lilacs in the Dust Bowl, Mom gave me anecdotes, but there were still missing pieces in terms of what was happening during the Great Depression in Manitoba. So I had to do a lot of research, and I began filling in the blanks, much like I did with Sunflowers Under Fire. And because it was COVID, I wasn't able to go to libraries like I was able to visit them physically for Sunflowers Under Fire. But it's amazing what you can find online. There were farming and heritage websites, so I could find about what farming was like during those the Great Depression. Newspapers, I was able to access the Winnipeg Free Press and the Winnipeg Tribune through the Winnipeg Public Library. And also stories from relatives. I was blessed that Genya, who was just a baby when she came to Canada in 1929, is still alive. She's in her early 90s and was a fabulous resource. I mean, she couldn't remember the very early part of the Great Depression, but she was able to share some stories that ended up in Lilacs in the Dust Bowl near the end of the Depression. And of course, there were family photos, not many, but there were few. And I discovered another character that I hadn't thought of was nature. Now, during the Great Depression, the farmers who set up their farms on the prairies had to contend with dust storms. They had to contend with grasshopper plagues. I also discovered there were scorching summers. In Manitoba, there were records being broken with the heat waves. And also in the winter, there were tremendous blizzards. And again, records were broken in terms of the freezing temperatures. So they had a lot to contend with. And I also used historical references. There were books I read that were fiction. I reacquainted myself with some of the feelings in Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck's book on the Great Depression in the US, and Canadian books, and also books of historical reference about Winnipeg and Selkirk Avenue, which saw a huge influx of Eastern Europeans in the early 20th century. And I use visual references like this poster promoting farmland in Canada. I mean, this is what Ukrainians saw back in the old country. A poster like this, advertising 160 akriv, which was equivalent to 130 morgans. And it said it had great lands, zemli, duża dobra zemля, and 200 milionів akriv, so 200 million acres in Canada. За кожного оселенця, for each settler, they were offering 160 acres for each settler for a nominal fee. They just had to get themselves over to Canada. The family trunks. So they packed, I remember seeing this trunk in my mother's and father's basement, and never thought much about it until I visited the Pier 21, the museum, and I saw a trunk just like the one my mother and father had, and this is what they brought over from the old country. A Warsaw street scene in 1929. Now, I've been very fortunate in my life. We've traveled to Europe, to Ukraine, to various countries in Europe and around the world, but I had never been to Poland. And I realized that my mother and my baba and my uncles traveled through Warsaw from Kibiercy, Volhynia, but I didn't really know, and I wanted to paint that scene with words, and so I did find this photo on the internet, 1929 photo of Warsaw, and I traced the route. I found out where the train station was in Warsaw, but they had to go down through down Metelitsa Street. And so this will help me to write that scene. I discovered that they sailed on the New Amsterdam. It was part of the Holland America line. And again, I was very lucky to have stumbled upon Captain Albert's blog. He works for the Holland America line, and he took a special interest in the history of the New Amsterdam and other old ships. And I read his blog and I wrote to him, and I was able to ask him very specific questions about the particular ship and the time when my Baba sailed, Baba and her family sailed from Rotterdam to Halifax. This was a third-class dining room, picture from the New Amsterdam. This is what they would have seen, and I think Baba and my mother and my uncles would have been very surprised, because to them this would have been luxury, even though it was third class. Arriving at Pier 21, Halifax, Nova Scotia, this is the kind of scene that they would have seen. And this is a museum that I actually visited. Our granddaughter Chloe was studying at Dalhousie University several years ago, and we took the opportunity to go and visit Pier 21. Had a fabulous museum. We saw the immigration hall. Now this is a picture of Dutch immigrants, but this is how our ancestors would have sat in this room, waiting to be processed, waiting to be welcomed into Canada and to have their passports stamped. In the museum, they have this railway section where you could go in and go inside and see what the interior and the exterior looked like that they traveled when they came to Canada, when we went across the country. And this is the Union Station in Winnipeg. Again, these photos were extremely helpful to me in writing and adding to my mother's anecdotes. I could visualize. I have a background in screenwriting, and so I like to write visually, and so this helped me to set the scenes. Here's the exterior, a very impressive building that they would have seen when they arrived in 1929. And this is the office in the Winnipeg Immigration Building where they were housed, where they stayed overnight while they had to wait to find a farm. Real estate agents were escorted them to places, and they would go and ask one of the clerks here in the office what farms were available and how they could arrange to see them. And this is Winnipeg back then on Portage in Maine. They would have stayed in Winnipeg for a while to get their bearings and to find out how they could, again, go and find a farm. And again, because my Baba and her family ended up not far from Winnipeg, they ended up going there for some work and also to sell their dairy and their cheese and also to attend church. Winnipeg City Hall, which no longer stands, but this is what the Winnipeg City Hall looked like back then, almost like a gingerbread style architecture. And this is a very impressive CPR train station, which was next to another impressive building, the Royal Alexandra Hotel. And the Palace Theatre, which also features in my novel. My mother turned out to be an avid moviegoer back in the 1930s. And this is the place where she would have gone to see movies. So again, it was helpful to find out some history about what movies were playing at the Palace Theatre on Selkirk Avenue and what my mother and father might have seen. Rethke's department store was also part of this Selkirk Avenue full of stores, banks, synagogues, delis, furniture stores. Now again, even though I grew up in Winnipeg and I visited my grandfather in Stony Mountain, which if you look at this map at the very bottom is Winnipeg, all the very dark. And then the green spot is Lilyfield, is where they had their second farm. And the pink is Rosser, where they had their first farm. And north of Lilyfield, up at the top, just north, you'll see Stony Mountain. And that was where my father lived. So, so my mother's family would sometimes go into Stony Mountain for staples to buy at the local store there in the village. It was only a very small town, but that's where they went. Now I have one picture of my Uncle Nat on the farm. This is him working in the field. And he was the eldest of the 4 children to come to Canada. This is a picture of the Rosser General Store that they would have attended and shopped at. And the Lethal Schoolhouse, where my mother and Ganya attended schools, as well as my mother's cousins. They also came over and joined them in Canada. Here's the Stony Mountain Penitentiary. This is where my father grew up in the village behind Stony Mountain Penitentiary. And this is where the Mazaret's family would have gone to the village behind for staples. And now I know the town quite well because I would visit my grandfather, Klevchuk, there in Stony Mountain. So again, that helped me to write the scenes where some of the story takes place there. Now with the stock market crash in the October 1929, they arrived in the summer of 1929, just 2 months before the stock market crash. And the economy tanked and there were so many unemployed. That was the beginning of the Great Depression. Men hopped on boxcars. This is something that the people who lived in the prairie provinces would have seen. Men out of work, looking for work, hopping the boxcars, traveling west to see if there were jobs in Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario. Farmers struggled. This is a picture of a farmhouse during the Great Depression. There were times that the only thing that survived was the Russian thistle. And the Bennett buggy. things got so bad that people couldn't afford gasoline for their cars, so they took the engine out of their cars and fastened them to their horses and turned them into a wagon. And it was called the Bennett buggy after the prime minister at that time. Now here's our mother's handwork. Besides working on the farm and working as a domestic, they did in Winnipeg as well, they also did a lot of handwork, a lot of baking, a lot of cooking and handwork. And this is my mother's bedspread that she made in hopes of getting married and having this beautiful bedspread in her marriage. These are samples of her crocheted handwork. And if you notice, the one on the left are lilacs. My mother was very talented with her hands, and she also did cross-stitch beautiful pictures. She cross-stitched pillowcases, wall hangings. Baba made braided rugs out of rags. Everything was mended. And then, of course, there's the food. Moraniki and whole of cheese and borscht and paska, and I'm sure those who here are of Ukrainian descent can name many, many more dishes. Grew up with kishka and stewed nuts and all those beautiful, that beautiful food. In my story, even though there were hard times, there were also good times, which included barn dances, picnics. They were very popular, and the Métis fiddler, Andy Desjardins, had a radio program, and he figures in my story too. He's there, and I remember my mother talking about Andy Desjardins showing up at the barn dance. And here is my mother in the middle with her two brothers, Harry Havarello and Mike Mihalko. And my mother was Eudokia. She was nicknamed Dunya and became Dolly in Canada. The Harry Dolly. And this was taken probably around 1936. And here's a family portrait taken around the same time. That's my, from the left at the top is Nat. He was the eldest. And below him is his wife, Elena, and their baby Vera, who was born in 1935. And Genya is a little girl who came as a baby in 1929, only several months old. Next to Nat is Mike with the white vest, my mother, and then Harry on the far right, and then of course my Baba Ukia in the satin dress. Now my books are available, and I'm very sorry I know that the book clubs wanted to order my book earlier on, but there was a problem with the ISBN, and thank you so much for your patience. It's been sorted out, so I've written the ISBN down here for reference if anybody wants to order it through their local bookstore. It's also available to paperback online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, McNally Robinson will bring it in. And because they're print on demand, they take a little longer to get them to your local bookstores. And Amazon, I think because they're printed in the US, the books, and also for the independent bookstores, they're also printed in the United States. So that's why the delay. They're available as ebooks, Kindle, Kobo, iBooks, Google Play, and Nook. And I do have Sunflowers Under Fire available as an audiobook. I'm hoping to record Lilacs in the Dust Bowl, but I haven't started yet. So that is the end of my slide presentation. And then I hope to read you just a couple of sections from Lilacs in the Dust Bowl so you get a sense of the flavor of the story. And then after that, I'm hoping that I'll be able to answer any of your questions. So Lilacs in the Dust Bowl, as I mentioned earlier, is my Baba's story of how they came to Canada. It's her and what was left of her family, how they immigrated in the summer of 1929, and how they survived during the Great Depression. And the first section I'm going to read to you is just after she has decided on a farm with 2 other families. When they arrived, the good land had already been taken up by the first wave of immigrants from the old country. And so there wasn't a whole lot left, and they ended up having to find a farm that would meet their needs. And that was hard because of the land, the good land was mostly gone. But they did find a farm, and they ended up living with 2 other families, 21 of them in one house, and they parceled off the land. So here is the section where they have already settled on this farm. With the purchase of a homestead settled at last, Lucia breathed easier, but her heart ached for what she'd left behind in Volhynia. This wasn't what she bargained for when she heard the 2 men talking about golden opportunities in Canada. She almost laughed at her own foolishness. She had taken her children halfway across the world on the back of some stranger's conversation. How many others had been duped like her? It wasn't only the lack of good land that bothered her, it was also the people. Though unfamiliar with the language, she could see the disparaging looks English speakers gave her when she approached. The sideways glances tossed her way when she couldn't converse in their tongue. When she tried the odd English word, she was met with derision. She quickly learned from the Ukrainian immigrants who had been in Canada for a while that the words hurled her way, bohunk, dumb Galician, and garlic stinker, were slurs against her nationality. This form of disrespect wasn't foreign to her. She'd experienced much the same under the thumb of the Tsar and later the Poles. It's no wonder Ukrainians stuck together. They believed in the old saying, an ox should keep company with oxen and a horse with horses. There was comfort in being with your own in a new land. What stung Lucia the most was the fact she traded all she knew for a land with little promise, and a community who gave the impression they wished she and her kin had never come. A full-throated sob threatened to pull her down, but she stopped herself. She'd had enough of crying in her life. She told herself there was always hope, for here there was peace. There were no marauders hiding in the forest, and no sounds of gunfire coming closer and closer. She took a deep breath. She'd sacrificed too much to give in to the gray clouds that hovered over her. She had to keep going, if not for herself, then for her 4 remaining children. She owed them that much. And as she'd done in the past, she prayed for the strength to continue. So that is that section. And then I'll move a little further down in the story. And this is about almost halfway through. And they've been experiencing some terrible weather. But it's now April. And by April, they thought the worst of the winter was over. A gentle breeze, coupled with the fresh smell of the earth awakening after a long sleep, brought renewed hope for a better year. The Karpinskis, that's the other family, who had threatened to leave in the spring, decided to stay. Prospects in the city were no better, they said. But as the days got longer and warmer, the 3 families faced new challenges. The improvement in weather also brought unexpected dust storms. Thick clouds of black dust swirled across country roads and through farmhouses. The air was so bad, Anna and Elena worried about their children's lungs, especially when one started coughing. It got so dark in the afternoon, lamps were lit 2 hours ahead of time. It seemed the sun had taken a holiday and wasn't about to return until the dust clouds dispersed. The 3 families did what they could to keep the dust outdoors. They covered up the edges of windows and doors with any rags they could find. Venturing out to feed the livestock, They covered their noses and mouths with handkerchiefs. Trips to the outhouse involved going with heads lowered to avoid eating debris as it flew around. Their eyes smarted from the dirt flying in, and they often had to stop and get the specks out before their eyes turned red. Lucia found the air so foul it was impossible to work in the garden and the fields. The dust continued to blow until midnight. It blew with a rustling noise, as if all the demons had sprung from hell and released a long, raspy sigh together. After days of flying dust, the storm abated, but left behind dirty houses, dirty barns, dirty chicken coops. In fact, dirty everything that stood in its way. Lucia held her head in her hands and bemoaned her lot. What hell is this? And there's just the final little section I'm going to read, and it's lighter in tone. So just to let you know, it's not all hard times during the Great Depression, even though they were very, very hard times. And the section I'm going to read to you happens on St. Andrew's Day Eve. And this is a conversation between my mother and my grandmother, between Dunya and Lucia Mazurev. And St. Andrew's Eve is known in the Ukrainian culture as a time when young girls put a basin of water under their headboard with a stick in it, and whoever they dream of that night, that will be the man that they're going to marry. They expect some kind of magic that night. So Dunya is 17, and she's been thinking about possibly getting married. At bedtime, her mother reminded her to put a stick of wood in a basin of water. Dunya, whoever you dream of tonight, that'll be who you'll marry. Is that what you did, Mama? Dunya said as she slid the basin under the head of her bed. No, your babcha never mentioned this tradition when I was young. It's too bad you never tried it. I wonder if you would have dreamt about Tato. Maybe. Her mother sat down on the bed. We did other things in the old country. A group of girls would get together, maybe 6 or 7 of us. Each one would bake some pampushki and put them on a bench. Then they'd call the dogs to see which girls' sweet buns the dogs would eat. The ones they chose signaled that she'd be the one to get married first. Was that true? Yes. But sometimes the boys in the village would hear of the girls' plans and feed the dogs so they wouldn't be hungry, and hide and watch the girls coax the dogs to eat. Of course, the dogs weren't interested because their stomachs were full. I like this way better. After her mother left, Dunya couldn't wait to fall asleep. Tonight, she would dream about her husband-to-be. If she were still living in Kivertsi, she probably would have been married by now, especially since she looked older than her years. She didn't know any married girls or boys in the Rosser district or in Stony Mountain. Maybe it was because no one had anything. Everyone was too poor to have a wedding. Excited, Dunya tossed a while before she fell asleep. Images of the boys she knew popped into her head. She didn't know many, since she'd been too busy working to socialize much. Would one of them appear in her dream? He had to be young. She couldn't bear marrying someone old enough to be her father. She needn't have worried, as that night she dreamt of a tall, dark, and handsome young man who took her by the hand and led her to the edge of a lake. His face was kind, a face she hadn't seen before. She woke up startled, wondering how she was going to meet the man of her dreams. And that is the end of my reading. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Diana, for that wonderful presentation on the research that went into the writing of your book. Your reading of the excerpts from Lilacs and the Dust Bowl have certainly left me wanting to read your new book. It sounds like a fascinating story. And, you know, not just a story about your Baba, but also a story about early Canadian immigration to the West. And those pictures that you showed, was very insightful, because I think a lot of Ukrainians with that background heritage will find it very interesting from their own personal perspective. So we have some time for questions, and if anyone wants to submit one, then please do so through the chat line. I have a few questions in already, so I'll just go ahead and read them to you, Diana.
Okay.
So how difficult or easy was the self-publishing process? This is now about being a writer.
Yes, well, it was interesting because I had an agent for my screenplays in Toronto and Vancouver way back when. And I think every writer wants to be traditionally published. But by the time I came around to writing Sunflowers Under Fire, I was in my early 70s. And I've been a member of a writer's critique group for over 20 years. Well, if I count the screenwriters group, that's 30 years. And I know how long it takes to get published. It takes a while to find a good agent, to find that right match. And then it takes a few more years to get your book on the shelf. And I decided I don't have time to wait. So I decided, and at that time, I had been going to the Surrey International Writers Conference for quite a few years. And I met a number of writers who were starting to self-publish, and it was gaining credibility. And there were resources online and an easy way to learn how to do it. So I learned how to do it. I mean, I've conducted workshops now at writers' festivals on how to self-publish. So it wasn't an easy process, but there's an awful lot of help online. And I find writers by and large are very generous to share tips on how to do it. So I feel very fortunate.
Thank you for that. We have another question. How long did it take for you to write Sunflowers Under Fire? Was Lilacs in the Dust Bowl a faster process?
Yes, Sunflowers Under Fire took me a good 8 years, I would think, off and on. Because I ended up, it's hard to find information about what happened in Eastern Ukraine, which is where my family came from. I can speak Ukrainian enough to get by, and we went to visit Ukraine, and I could converse with the locals easily. But a lot of the books are written in high Ukrainian, and it was very challenging, even to find them. I did consult history of Ukraine books through the Vancouver Library, Winnipeg Library, Toronto, New York Library. I even went to Stamford, Connecticut, which has a huge library of Ukrainian books, texts. And so I wanted to get it right. So it did take me a long time to write that one. Second book, Lilacs in the Dust Bowl, was easier because most of it took place in Canada. So I could have access to Canadian history and to the weather and the climate and farming conditions. And so that, and because it was COVID, we weren't traveling or seeing family back east, so I had time, and that maybe just took a couple of years to write.
Mm-hmm. All in all, though, it's quite a process. It's a real eye-opener. So how would you suggest we start, if anyone wanted to start to write their own family history? Do you have any suggestions as to how to start?
Talk to any living relatives that you have and start writing down those stories and follow the threads, whether they're relatives or friends. And then, and again, there's an awful lot of information online as well, but that's where I would begin.
Yeah, and I think you were very smart to have written notes when the stories were told. So that was a big help. I have a few more questions.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
My mother was an oral storyteller, so I was fortunate. I mean, my Baba wasn't. My Baba, I spent, again, she never talked about it, but my mother, I have to give her a lot of credit. for sharing her stories.
Mm-hmm. So on your website, it says your book is a historical and biographical fiction. So this person is wondering why you chose fiction versus nonfiction, rather than writing a biographical novel. Was it so you could have more liberty to fill in the blanks?
It wasn't so much a liberty, I had to dramatize some of the scenes and fill in the supporting characters to do justice to my mother's anecdotes. And I guess you're right, Laurisa, it is liberty. As I said, my mother there was a lot of blanks in her story. So, and because I had to create these imaginary these conversations, which I obviously didn't hear, and my mother never said, it became fiction. I debated about it for a while, but there was just too many supporting characters and too many imagined conversations that to justify me calling it nonfiction or even creative nonfiction.
Mm-hmm. And did your background as a clinical social worker, teacher, writer influence your storytelling?
Absolutely. Well, I knew my uncles as adults, so I knew their personalities, so I could guess what they were like as children and how they developed. I mean, I had the anecdotes, so that informed me, but then I also had their qualities, their character when they were adults. Harry was shyer. He didn't talk, my Uncle Harry. He wasn't as boisterous as his two older brothers. Mihalko was an artistic type, so his temperament, and so all of that, yes, helped my background.
And were the main characters outside of Lukia's family based on real people, fiction, or a mix of both?
A mix of both. I used my Baba went to Sabor, St. Mary's the Protectress Cathedral at the corner of Burles and St. Clair, Winnipeg. I attended with her every Sunday, taught Sunday school there. I knew the church. There's some history in the church. My mother talked about it, so I used some, real life characters like the Father Majewski and and Walter Sestoon, who led the choir. So there certainly were real life characters that ended up in my story, as well as the imaginary ones.
Mm-hmm. And someone is asking, what is your next book going to be? Will this turn into a trilogy?
It wasn't going to be, but it is, yes. I've started working on the third one, yes. And it's a continuation of, I think, what happens. The World War II is starting. My mother and father's love story has hit a bit of a wall, and and so it develops in the third book.
Oh,
and they have quite the story too. They have quite the story.
I have a question here about what's the percentage of fiction versus fact in your storytelling, in the books. In the books,
that's a good question. That's a really good question. I would say that 60%, 70%. I mean, the stories, the anecdotes that I share about my mother and her brothers, I mean, that is largely true. But the fill-ins, like, exactly what movie did they go to? I'm not sure, but I had them see a certain movie at that time. So that part. But my mother's love of movies and the fact that she went there and why she went there and all of that is true. So and my mother and my Baba's work as a domestic for part of the story on Selkirk Avenue. I knew the people's names. I knew how she felt about it. experiences, how the relationships, but what they said to one another, I don't know, but I made that up. You know,
Mhm.
it's, but you know, so hope that answers the question. I would say, yeah, 60,
Mhm.
70%, quite true.
Yeah. Is there any writing about relations with the Indigenous people? Now, I'm not sure if that was meant, whether you were aware of writings or whether, because I know probably most people have not read your book yet, whether there is any description of any interactions with Indigenous people.
No, and I don't recall my parents ever talking about any encounters with Indigenous people
Mhm.
during their, you know, that did not come up. Yeah, I think the only reference was about the land that they received, how difficult it was, you know, but I don't think they had the knowledge that this was land that had been taken away from Indigenous people when they arrived. This was
Mhm.
land that was offered to them by the
Mhm.
Canadian government. So
Mhm.
I'm not even sure if in their lifetime they became aware
Mhm.
of it like we do today.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a very interesting comment.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's another one on a different angle here. Was superstition common in your family upbringing? Did your Baba continue to foretell?
Yes, very much so. They were superstitious. It many a time they really believed in you know, whether if a bird hit a window or what the dreams meant. And I remember them scaring me when I was growing up. My mother would say I had a bad dream. Be careful, Diana. You know, be careful. And you know, and
Mhm.
there was a lot of yeah, yeah, just very much so. Or even like the St. Andrews um, evening where my mother put a stick in a bowl and they believe that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yes.
Yes, so you mentioned earlier on that you run some workshops on family storytelling. Is there one that is coming up that we might join?
Not, no, I have nothing planned at the moment. I have done it before. Um,
Mhm.
I think if there was of interest, someone can get a hold of me, uh, you know, but there's nothing planned at the moment, Laurisa.
Okay, yeah. Um, okay, I have one that's talking about a honey cake. Was there a recipe of a honey cake in one of your books? Or
My mo-
mention of a honey cake?
yeah, I have my mother's honey cake recipe. Yes, she made a lot of honey cakes.
Mhm. Okay, so we have Kathy Kostuk available from We Are Ukrainian Book Club. So Julie, I'm not sure how you want to bring Kathy in. Kathy Kostuk is someone who has started a new book club. So I had a question about, whether people could join the Rozmova Book Club, but right now we are full. But you have started an online book club. So I'm wondering if you might share your experience of that. And from what I understand, it's a similar idea where readers are wanting to know more about Ukrainian history, culture, and their stories.
Yes, I took on this. I had this crazy mad idea that maybe somebody might want to do a book club, like might want to join in and do an online book club. And our membership is over 50, and
Wow.
we have currently we're divided into 3 time zone groups, and we'll potentially be going into 4. We have members from Australia, Ukraine, Germany, Ireland, England, Canada, and much of the United States. And most of the interest is varied. I'm hoping to get more interest from the Australian people because we have our stories of our prairie and North American type immigrants and settlers out in the prairies. But there's another whole story of people that went from Ukraine to Australia, which I wasn't even aware of and became aware of through this process. In any case, so the way it is they're on Facebook. It is a private group, but it's open to people being invited. It's called We Are Ukrainian Book Club, and they just have to request. And the people are a little bit screened, as in, do they have, so that we're not I've had a few people try to join that are not obviously the right kind of people that should be part of this group. So to say that, possibly scammers. But other than that, everyone's welcome. Now, not everyone who has joined that Facebook group is interested in being part of a Zoom online reading group. And some of them have said no, but they just want to join to be able to see the lists of books and book recommendations and learn a little bit more about that. And so, we're in the growth stage. We're in the early days stage right now. So I'm sure there's a few mistakes, but for our first book, we picked Sunflowers Under Fire, and we had great results with it. Everyone read it. I'm sure a lot more people read it than actually showed up for the meeting. So it was really, really good. And two of the three have chosen to go on and read the next one. So that's great, Diana. Thank you. And the one other group, they just wanted a different type. So it's a little more challenging for me because then now I'm reading two books as opposed to one. But yeah, it's interesting.
So I just wanted to jump in to say that our book club, Rozmova Book Club, read Sunflowers Under Fire this year as well. And we have a really nice review of the book on the blog. So if anyone is interested in having a look at that, as well as I mentioned earlier, we have book lists and reviews of some of the books we've read. So we're pretty well at the 8 o'clock timeline. So I'd like to thank everyone for your enthusiastic participation. It was wonderful. Thank you to Diana for telling us her Baba Lukia story and inspiring us all to think about our ancestors' journeys. And thank you to Julia for event production, and Oksana for event graphics, and Helena, the SVI librarian, for the resources she has shared on Facebook.
And I just like to say hello. I'd like to say thank you again to St. Vladimir's Institute and Rozmova Book Club for having me. I really enjoyed today, and thank you.
No, thank you.
Well, it was wonderful to hear from here little excerpts from your book. So thank you. And of course, thank you, Laurisa, for moderating all the questions and getting through all of those. So if anyone has any questions after the session, you're welcome to send them in through the Cultural SVI Gmail address, or if you pop them into the chat, we'll see them after the event and we'll get you some of those answers. So thank you, of course, Laurisa, like I mentioned, and Diana. And we'd like to, of course, thank the Seuss Foundation of Canada for their generous sponsorship, for allowing for this event to happen for free. But of course, if you did enjoy it, please do consider making a donation to SVI so we can continue future cultural programming and etc. Of course, as this is our last event of this spring season, we would like to thank all the donors who have donated from January to June and who have continued to support SVI and our cultural programming events, of course. So thank you all, and my дуже вам дякуємо за вашу підтримку. as like I mentioned, as well, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but behind the scenes of SVI, we have had a few cultural committee members. So I would just like to sincerely thank Karen Yermol-Franco and Helena Perun for making all these events possible, working behind the scenes to get everyone connected and bring such interesting topics to the forefront of SVI and all of these guests. So thank you so much to both of you. It has been a pleasure working with you, of course. And if you are interested in future SVI, programs, please do visit our website, follow us on Facebook and Instagram to know more about what we're going to do in the future. Well, I hope everyone has a great rest of your evening and see you next time. So dobranoc. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.